Feel the debate. Fire up your day. Middle Ground Coffee is here. Bold flavor, no size, just forward. Grab yours at store.themiddlegroundmike.com and let's go. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Middle Ground Mike. We got a great guest here today. I've had the chance to talk to her a little bit. Great personality. Joe seems happy. Leah Brown, how are you doing today?
I'm so well, thank you, Joe. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for being on. Like I said, your background is phenomenal. And that's, your group seems to want to do a lot of good. And it's just kind of like, you talk a lot about like the journey, right? Your journey in like a chaotic world, things like that. Give everybody a little bit of description about who you are and where you come from.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I am currently based in the UK. I run a values-driven problem-solving consultancy called the Wayfinders Group. I am a recovering mergers and acquisitions lawyer turned mediator, and that passion for mediation has taken me into restorative justice. I'm the elder daughter of two. And I'm passionate about many things, including playing my violin, playing team sports, and walking my dog on the beach.
I got three dogs. They're all big babies. I got
I have a
one. He's
cavapoo.
almost 100.
She's tiny.
Oh, I got one. My one, he's 100 pounds and just wants to jump in your lap like he's a lap. You can lay next to me, but you can't sit in my lap. Yeah, I mean, we got a big backyard, so it helps, but he's a big old baby. Most dogs bark. I mean, he yelps when he's happy. It's a very, very odd dog. Let's kind of dive in a little bit to kind of like your early chaos in your world, right? How did that look? How did it kind of make you who you are and kind of get you?
So I was born in the US in Maryland and moved to the UK as a 2-year old. So I grew up in the UK. I did actually end up back in the US for high school. But yeah, two working parents. My parents were both working and both studying their PhDs whilst we were young. That created quite a few scheduling conflicts, as well as I think just some people don't know how to resolve conflict effectively. So I think there was a lot of intelligence in the house, but not a lot of emotional intelligence in the house. And it was a very prolonged amount of chaos, whether that was at home, whether that was at school, a lot of raised voices and unresolved conflict and poor communication. And I think for me, I channeled my, I suppose, dislike of this into achievement. So I was very successful in sports. Was a fencer for the county and nationally. I was a very proficient violin player. I was going to be a professional violinist. I was smart and I did well at school. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I was very much satisfying the kind of eldest daughter tropes of achievement as a form of escapism. And I think I took on a lot of the powerlessness of the conflict and would do whatever I could to solve the problems because everywhere I looked there were problems to be solved. So it was quite natural to me as a problem solver to choose a career as a lawyer. I know a lot of people choose law because they're very passionate about justice. And as it happens, it's taken me 38 years to work out that I am also very passionate about justice. But I was attracted to a career in the law because people were coming with a problem that needed to be solved. And the only person that could solve that type of problem was a lawyer. And so that was peppered through all of my applications, my ability to assimilate huge amounts of information. But you see, the thing was that just because I had grown up and was now an adult, that didn't mean that chaotic environments and conflict didn't continue to find me. And my entire legal career, for the first, I think probably the first 10 years of my legal career, were careening from incredibly difficult, toxic environments with outlandish things happening that most people don't get to see across a 40-year career. And I was seeing them over and over and over again in different organizations. And I was not the common denominator, though you could be forgiven for thinking that. And so I said, actually, what's going on here? Who am I? And can I change the way that I am encountering these situations? Can I change the way in which I show up in these situations? What other skills do I need to have to be able to show up in these situations differently? And part of that was switching from being a lawyer to being a mediator so that I could change the dynamics, so that I could be the person who holds space for those difficult conversations, or for people to share what's on their mind and to help them figure out how they can be the best version of themselves, or to figure out how they want to rebuild trust with somebody, or how they want to move on and never speak to that person again. And I realized that there was something about the kind of objective, independent, non-judgmental posture of a mediator that was received so completely differently than the kind of adversarial, judgmental, very resolute and assertive lawyer that was much more in keeping with my skill set and my passion, because it turns out that being brought up in an environment that was dysfunctional and that was conflict ridden, I had this real sense of injustice, and therefore the ability to hold out opportunities for other people to reconcile and to be transformed was the outworking of my desire to see things that I could never see in my family of origin.
But you said you're, I believe, 38.
Yeah, 38.
So you kind of go. I'm 40, so we kind of pretty much grew up in the same time period. I love kind of like what you were saying about how like the stuff going on at home, right? So I grew up with a single dad that had zero patience, zero debate. My dad told me once, he goes, "I love you, but I don't care about your opinion." He goes, "I run the house, you do as I say." And I was like, I learned kind of, well, just do what dad says, and I'll get whatever I want, and just don't get in trouble, and everything will be fine. But there really wasn't that like talking. I mean, we do now that I'm older, but and so it was just that I didn't. And my wife used to joke around with me. She'd be like, "You have daddy issues." She's like, "You're the only guy I've ever met with daddy issues." Just joking with me, because I was always like, well, when I'm stressed out, I would always just, my dad was alive, I'd call my dad. My dad would be like, "This is how you need to do it. This is how you need to think. This is how you need to function." And then when you don't have that, especially when you come from that type of background, right? That's just that conflict ridden, right? You just, I guess, as you kind of become an adult, you become dependent on that too, as like a point of reference. You're like, okay, this experience made me do that.
Think it's that, but I think it's two things. It's unlearning the people pleasing tendencies, and it's learning that you have your own voice and you have your own thoughts and feelings and reactions to whatever it is that you're experiencing, that you have completely overridden for so long to be able to survive, and finding safety in that process, even though it is so alien to you. One of the questions I find it hardest to answer is, well, how do you feel? And I spend all day listening to how other people feel, or getting them to figure out what it is they feel. And then I get to the end of the day and I'm like, well, how do I feel? And I'm like, well, I don't really know. And I have to sit with it. And I get there eventually, but there's a discipline behind that, because nobody was asking. Nobody cared. Nobody cared how I felt about it, because it didn't
Yeah,
it didn't
agreed.
matter. And it was, just, what are you complaining about? Just get on with it. And I'm like, well, and I wouldn't say that I was overly emotionally sensitive, objectively speaking, but I think when there's a disconnect between what you need as an individual and what is available to you, you as a child form a sense of, I am fearful because I don't feel safe, and there is no one here to enable me to feel safe. Okay, I need to lie to myself that I'm safe in this situation. And from that posture, you go out into the world. And that wasn't working for me. I had a breakdown in 2017 because that's how much it wasn't working for me. And I kept kind of papering over it and, oh, it'll be fine, oh, it'll be fine, just keep going. And there will always be a reckoning, whether that's with your health, whether that's in your job, whether that's in your relationships. Something will come about, usually in your late 20s or early 30s, where you are confronted by this lie that you're living effectively, where you say, well, actually, I don't endorse that. And I'm either breaking a contract with myself, or I'm breaking a contract with the person who's had control over me. And neither of those things are comfortable. But actually, I chose freedom. And I will choose freedom for the people that I work with any day, because what we're turning into is a society of people who are unhealed. and that means that they are harmful and unhinged, it's generational, right? So it just keeps giving birth to more and more harm and unhealthiness. And in a therapized culture, it's even harder to get to the root of some of the things that people have experienced, because everybody's so emotionally literate now in a way that they weren't when we were growing up, or certainly our parents' generation. And so, it's a real privilege, I think, to hold space for those lightning moments where people see themselves or their own needs for the first time. But, I'm also a work in progress, and I have to take that extra step to check in with myself and say, is this in alignment with what I'm trying to do? And what voice am I listening to in this situation? Is it my own? Or is it something else that still, is in the back of my head, controlling the way that I.
Something I found, like, you said you had a breakdown 2017. I was in, I believe it was 16, but, I kept getting sick, getting sick, getting sick, and kept going to the hospital. My wife works for a hospital system. Just I kept getting sick, and they kept going, "Well, it's, either A, your weight, or B, it's, pop, or you drink too much, or soda," you guys might call it in Michigan, we call it pop. You probably know that part, though. They were just trying to find reasons because they couldn't figure anything out. Like, they just, and then one day I go, and it just kinda started. It was about a 6-month process. And after 6 months of being in on people, right? So my job is kind of like, "Hey, we've been kinda in and out for 6 months, what's going on here? You've either gotta get this together, or we gotta find someone who will," which I don't blame them, right? They're a company. And then I go in there, and they're like, and so pretty much just I had a breakdown. Everything my whole life that I had been so confident about, everything was just do in order, just shattered. And it was just, it was odd, because it was something that I had never experienced before. I had no idea. I resented, my wife. I resented everything in existence. And so I had to learn. I went and seen someone. I had a therapist, and I kind of really had to learn, like, okay, hey, the one thing I found is how to, like, regulate myself. Is okay if I'm feeling any kind of way, anxious, depressed, take like a 15-minute nap, and for whatever reason, that, like, regulates my mind, and I wake up and I'm like, "Okay, now I can kinda just face this head on." And it was just, it was very weird. You go up from being so confident in your 20s, right? Like, you feel like you have the world by the, you know, and then I'm just, like, wondering how many people in our age group have truly been through that.
If I'm honest, I think a lot of people hide from the precipice and so don't jump. I think it takes particular frustration or determination to push through. I mean, I did years of trauma counseling. And the one of the things that caused the problem for me was my mother always told me that I was stupid. Which, I mean, when you're incredibly intelligent and you look down on everybody else in society as substandard, then I can kind of understand that. But it was when she was arrested and sectioned, or I suppose, what do we call it in the States when you get transported to a psychiatric facility?
Yeah, I'm drawing a blank.
Yeah, that. And I was speaking to the doctors because in the UK, under the legislation, like, I'm responsible for her institutionalized. Yes, that's the one. I'm responsible for the institutionalized person as the eldest child if they're not married, or if their parents are not around. And I was speaking to the doctor, and she said to me, "So it seems like your mother's quite intelligent. Like, I know that you're quite intelligent as a lawyer, but, like, you're nowhere near as smart as she is." And I just thought, how dare you? And it really alivened something in me that made me realize that I had always looked at things through a particular lens, and I wasn't able to distance myself from that lens because I hadn't been taught to ever see anything but through that lens. And there was a huge kind of freeing process when I found the value in the ways that I was different from her, the ways in which my intellect is different in some areas, superior in other areas, but not up for comparison is the most important thing. And I think for me, I think realizing through that therapeutic process how much I had been carrying and how many things had happened and how much I was involved in or felt responsible for that was way above my pay grade, I think was what culminated in me reaching this point where I was like, I can't do this anymore. And it wasn't a, I want to end my life, can't do this anymore. It was a, I cannot continue to live in this way. Something needs to change so that I can continue to go on. But also, oh my goodness, I'm the problem. What do I need to do? Like, what process do I need to commit to? Who do I need to talk to? Who can help me? And it was amazing how many people I went through who were not able to help me to get to a place where I could find somebody who was able to work with me. And the irony was that I needed to find somebody who was as intelligent, if not more intelligent, so that they could be on my level to work through some of the incredibly deep challenges that I was facing without judging them or feeling insecure about them. And that was a wonderful opportunity that I appreciate so many people don't have. It was incredibly expensive. It was, I don't even know how I kept my career afloat during that kind of 5.5 years. But I'm so grateful for the way that it enabled me to both see myself, but also the people around me much clearer, but also, most importantly, gave me the tools to be able to see people in general so that I would be equipped to do the work that I do now.
Yeah, no, I mean, that stuff it's definitely very challenging. COVID really, a lot of people went through, I mean, maybe, especially with isolation. I used to be somebody that I would love going, taking my kids, hey, let's go out, let's check something out at the store. And now I'm like, yeah, no, man, there's too many crazy people. The people are kind of going off the rockers. These days you don't know what they're gonna do. My wife's like, man, it's like you used to be the one I couldn't get to stay home, and now it's completely reversed. And I was like, yeah, going through COVID, you just kind of seen a whole side of people. Maybe you knew, but you just kind of thought maybe it was overblown. And then COVID, it brought out the worst. And I remember being at I think it was a hardware store, and I just seen this elderly guy just going. She wasn't wearing a mask, and I mean, and I'm sure in the states that was like a big like yes no thing. And I mean, I get where he was coming from per se, but I'm like, man, she looks like she's like 20, if that. There's just no reason to take it that far, man. Like just and next thing you know, the security people are coming over there, and now you got this older guy at the store. All just it just created that just chaotic situation.
It's so hard though, because I hear a situation like that and I think something is going on for him and it's got nothing to do with that mask. It's got nothing to do with that hardware store and it's got nothing to do with that cashier. And people aren't seeing him and he doesn't know how to communicate and he's doing the best that he can to communicate out of a pressure cooker. And what he doesn't need is to be incarcerated for having an outburst at the store. And yeah, I think it's so hard to be able to make interventions in situations like that because the people around them are usually not equipped to see what's really going on beneath the surface and to give them grace in that situation, to recognize that everyone in that situation is doing the best that they can, even if they are acting completely unhinged.
Let's take a quick break.
Tired of the noise and spin? Join the Middle Ground Mike Patreon for 7 days for free. And then it's just $1 a month afterwards. Real talk, real people right now. Sign up today, middlegroundmike.com. Click on the button. Yeah, you were kind of talking about things like that. In the United States, they closed down a lot of things like that between like the 60s and the 80s. Like pretty much all but a couple spots in each state closed.
Mm.
The current president just signed an executive order essentially giving all those places an opportunity to reopen. And so that kind of made me like start digging a little bit, and the reason why is, like why traditional systems are failing survivors, people going through it. Because there's really not very many places, I don't know about there, but especially here in the States for them to go. There's just nowhere for them to go. So they kind of just get left out, to dry. And I think that's what creates some of the problems that are in today's society. 40, 50 years ago, if someone was hitting like a really, really low point, they went crazy from stress, they just cracked. There was a place for them to go. Hopefully they healed, right? For them, not just hopefully you get better.
Mixed feelings about this, having experienced institutionalizing both sides of the pond. And here in the UK, one of the challenges that I found in being involved in that process multiple times is that they don't offer therapeutic counseling. Help me understand how you've got a series of mental health situations that are compounded by whatever people's individual circumstances are. There is no focus whatsoever on rehabilitation. It is medical treatment, observation, and then you need to go because we need the bed. And that just creates this kind of cycle where people are in and out and in and out and in and out and never able to live independently for long enough to be able to build a life that's sustainable. So I take issue with that. But in the US, I mean, I think the problem is that it's so easy for the system to be manipulated. So for example, for I don't know, in a domestic abuse situation, for a husband to procure a situation where his wife looks crazy and then she's stuck in this facility indefinitely without the ability to get out because a diagnosis has been made over her that kind of renders her unable to work or disrupts her life or commits her to kind of some kind of financial challenges indefinitely. And I mean, that's true here too, to a degree. But I do agree that as a first response to any kind of situation, having the option to institutionalize people is great. But I do think there needs to be a greater focus on rehabilitation. And there also needs to be a greater focus on training in a way that people actually understand the complexity of the challenges that people are coming in with, the intersectionality and comorbidity of some of the mental health challenges that people are experiencing. And I haven't seen the investment in the systems either side of the pond to render that viable.
Yeah, and and I'm kind of hoping that they'll do that here. It's going to be a very tricky situation, but I truly feel like especially in today's world, there's a lot. Let's try to fix it. Where he's growing up then, it's kind of like, well, take a drink of water, swallow it down, buddy, and just forget all about it. It may come up in 20 years, but these next 20 years are going to be great. And that's kind of like where that comes in. And I relate that in the States compared to 70 years ago when actually you didn't need a background check to get a gun. Anybody could just go buy one. But yet with more checks and balances in place these days, there's more gun violence. But I think that's because there's people who are in a certain spot, certain situation. So I'm kind of hoping that, there is, with that investment, hopefully they can make some changes because the United States is facing an ungodly crazy, especially with the roles. It's kind of reversed in the United States, not reversed, but it's changed. I talked about this with another guest. Women are now in the United States compared to their grandmothers. They're very hey, it's a completely different world for them. But where that's different for guys, and this is something I haven't really experienced this because I've got a phenomenal wife, and I mean, I'm a very lucky man to where she is independent, she works and everything, but somehow we kind of like just defaulted with certain things into like those natural roles. To be honest, we never really set anything up like that. It just kind of fell into place. But where I was getting to with that is, you know, where men are like, you got to be a little bit more modern these days. But in almost every situation, he's still expected to, or he want to define that. Like, and that is just, I think that as a gender, as whatever, men just don't grow up hardwired that way. Men are a little bit more simple in a lot of situations. They're like, hey, I want to work hard, I want to do these things. And now they're kind of like, hey, okay, hey, you gotta be active for the kids, you gotta be active for this, you gotta be active for that. And that has
I think a lot
changed.
about this lately. And I was
Yeah,
listening to
it
somebody
changed everything.
on social media over the weekend, and basically our generation, the girls were taught something different than the men. So we were kind of treated like glass and very protected and very encouraged and pushed to be successful educationally and independent, and but the men weren't schooled in what they need to be to respond to that or to keep up with that or to be comfortable in that. And so you end up with a disconnect for a whole generation for, well, how are we supposed to relate to each other, and what is right and what is wrong, and how do we move past this clash of expectations. And so you have men feeling completely disengaged and like, I can never satisfy my wife and she's never happy, and like nothing I do is ever enough and I don't earn enough, and all of that, which is a total flip of what our parents' generation experienced, because that imbalance was not so pronounced. But also, you've got a bunch of women who are unapologetic for their success and uncompromising in their expression of their needs. And that is very, I can see ways in which that is very emasculating. I can see ways in which it's very challenging, because the men are expected to kind of step up, and what it looks like to step up is to be a man. But you've also got to temper that with the different challenges that men have experienced with the evolution of, well, internet technologies accessible at a fingertip, as well as wider political forces, as well as other sociological challenges. I'm not going to go into any detail, but the broader question of what is a man remains open. And I think there are, again, both sides of the pond, more so probably in the US because of its connection to conservative theology. But there are very different views depending on which circles you're in as to how you would answer that question. And I think the most important thing is context. And I'm a believer that people should seek to be the best versions of themselves, not cardboard copies of other individuals. And we are all a product of our families of origin and whatever work we've decided to do to overcome whatever legacy it is they gave to us.
Yeah, know, you talk sometimes about like restorative, kind of like when we were talking. I think more of like a restorative approach is really big for our generation compared to and it's not saying no, the younger generations don't do in terms of because they don't have like we had a blueprint a little bit, even if it was a very flawed one. We had a blueprint. They do not have a blueprint because we haven't even figured out how to make a blueprint based on the new world,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
kind of like how would how does a restorative approach?
That's a really interesting question. I would say for us, one of the challenges of a blueprint, I would posit, is just that acknowledgement piece, right? We're not even trying to get to an apology or to amends. We're just like, can we just agree that you failed? Can we just agree that this was not as it ought to have been? Can we just agree that you didn't do the work, right? And we're stuck there. We can't get people beyond that. So that's part of it. And people are very critical of millennials, partly for that reason, because we've been the first people to be like, but it's not right.
Yes.
So a restorative approach, I think, because I don't think that we as a generation have sought apologies per se, because we recognize we're not going to get one. I think accountability doesn't necessarily come from the people who have caused the harm. It comes from, okay, well, what can we do differently? So if you look at the way that millennials parent versus the way Gen X parented or baby boomers parented, there have been some seismic shifts in the way millennials parent. And I think taking accountability for doing things differently and saying we don't have to follow the status quo because it's the status quo is step one. But then I also do think this kind of amends, this kind of recognition that sweeping things under the rug does not create a better outcome. And so how can we own that legacy and make amends? So again, probably the most therapized generation, because we've said, okay, well, if it's not right, and if you're not going to take responsibility for it, and if I've got to move on without getting an apology from you, then I've got to be the change that I want to see in the world. Okay, let me own that. Let me do the work and let me move forwards. And I don't like that because it's so individualized. But I do like that because it creates a collective understanding of we've got consensus on what progress looks like. And so I'm not convinced actually that the latest generation doesn't have a blueprint. I just think they've got different challenges. And we always cop out and say, well, their challenges predominantly are technological. But I actually think that generation's biggest challenges are relational, because they haven't been taught to relate to one another. Like, who goes out and plays on their bike in the yard, or gets a radio and goes to the opposite side of the park with their friend to have a conversation, or goes to fly a kite, or goes on camping holidays impromptu, or whatever it is, get outside and go and do something. No, they're inside and they're chained to their screens and their devices, and they go away and they sit together and they're chained on their devices. So I think there's something about how do we relate to one another, and how do we build effective, deep relationships with one another in person without, not aided by technology. How do we work together with colleagues in the workplace? How do we navigate difficult conversations? How do we share a process of moving beyond disagreement. How do we recover personally when we're in a state of conflict? How do we recover with other people when we're collectively in a state of conflict? All of those things are different. But I do think that the principles remain the same no matter where you enter in the restorative framework. And I think the number one opportunity, regardless of who you is, are you willing to have a conversation? Are you willing to examine what has happened? And are you willing to own your part in it, find agency that you do have, and go from there?
Yeah, no, I've got a really good example. Kind of that relates to a little bit. My dad is, he said, I'm really sorry, kind of. I can't say sorry. I forgot how he exactly worded it, but it was like, I was hard on you because I had these kind of expectations. I didn't handle it right. Looking back, but I just wanted the best for you. And this was the only way. It just changed my whole thought process. And then, I was like, okay, well, maybe getting married and having kids is because where before that, I was like, man, I do not want to deal with that stress. I do not want that going on in my life. There is nothing about that. That sounds like a good time. My dad always, oh, when you get older, that changes. And then I was like, it was just that moment, that you see, okay, you change because your parents change. That role changes, and that is, and I think the younger generations are having a harder time finding out. It was a little bit more defined. It's not as defined.
Yeah, I think that's true. I was just looking to see if I could find it, but there's a really good book. I can't remember who the author is, but it's called How to Make Peace with Your Parents, and whether they are alive or whether they have passed. It's not exactly a workbook, but it's a very helpful discourse on how can you go through personal exercises and thought processes and psychological investigation to help you make peace with whatever has happened to you. Because in your dad's example, and the same is true of my dad, they have said very clearly, I did the best that I could, and I recognize that I didn't always get that right. In fact, I often didn't get that right, and I'm sorry, and I wish that I could have done things differently. I didn't know how. And then if you look at how they were parented, of course they didn't know how because they hadn't been shown how. And so it was actually impossible unless they did the work. But it was actually impossible for them to have done any differently. And I think that that's part of that process of learning to parent yourself is recognizing that you can't continue to punish somebody for the way that they did the best that they could to bring you up. All you can do is disrupt the cycle and do things differently yourself.
Yeah, and I've got a 15-year-old boy and I've got a 7-year-old boy. My 7-year-old is autistic. Technically, my 15-year-old has Asperger's. But if I didn't tell you, you would have like zero idea. I mean, when I was growing up, they would just be, yeah, he's antisocial, whatever. Like he probably would have never even got diagnosed. But it's just kind of definitely when you're raising. I mean, girls are a little bit. Everybody I've ever talked to says I would rather raise boys any day of the week. So much simpler than raising girls. I was just I was talking to someone and it was just kind I was very boys do have emotions too, and I can tell you my 15-year-old is way more expressive with his emotions than I was. Because I'm sitting here, I'm like, I would have been like, nope, yep, I'll just hopefully it gets better. So like, kind of like with your group, like the wayfinders and then the systemic change, right? So how does that group and like how are we filling that need that's there? And obviously uncomfortable truths are always something it's difficult, but I think for me personally, feedback is always important, right? Especially in any situation. How does that kind of play into making people comfortable with feedback? And and just kind of talking about.
I mean, a really good starting question is like, what's the worst that somebody can possibly say about you? Okay, great. So it can't possibly be as bad as that. So shall we see what they say? And people are often pleasantly surprised by feedback. We have a culture in the UK where unsolicited feedback is just not a thing, and people can see you making an absolute hash of things, and they won't intervene. They'll just watch you, and they'll be like, "Yeah, I mean, I could see it going wrong, but it just wasn't my responsibility to tell you." That does not happen in the United States, and so I say that partly joking, because this society that I'm speaking into doesn't want to hear about restorative approaches. They don't really want to connect the dots to see why there's a shortage in acknowledgement and how that plays through to really meaningless apologies. If you watch shows like Love is Blind or I'm struggling to think of other Married at First Sight, The Bachelor, whatever, where relationship conflict comes up and they're like, oh, I'm sorry if I offended you, but it's like, this is not an apology. You don't know what an apology is, or you're choosing not to give one. But actually, when you magnify that on a much broader scale, when the stakes are so much higher and you give an even more insufficient apology, you're causing significant damage to the person who's on the receiving end of that. And so, one of the things I found in my practice is I've got to take several steps back and educate before I can actually deploy the kind of blueprints that I can see would solve the wider strategic problems. And so, yeah, I'm very much in the education phase, which means, okay, how does this need to be embedded in existing legislation? What does the research say? What does public polling say? What do leaders who are working in these environments, what is their experience? And what would help them, support them in their roles, support them in embedding these approaches? What do pilots look like in these spaces? And so that's kind of where I'm at the moment. And then I think more broadly in my wider change management practice, I just embed these things as rote. It's just part of the way that I deliver mediations. It's just part of the way I do governance reviews. Just part of the way that I engage with any of my clients, giving them space to say what could be done better, or what they liked, or what they didn't like, or what they need from me next time. And just creating that open dialogue so that they can be free to tell me if something isn't working. So I don't get to the end of the assignment and they're like, okay, that was great. We never want to work with you again. Like you should never be in that situation. And if you are, you're not asking enough questions. But I do think that there is a real place for curiosity when it comes to giving and receiving feedback. And I think listening effectively when it comes to hearing that feedback. So not just taking on board what somebody's saying, but clarifying what it is that you've heard. Because even in the communication of feedback, we hold off because we don't want to upset somebody. And so we choose our words very carefully, and then we don't really say what it is that we're meaning to say. So we're like, oh, well, I said it. And then, but they haven't changed. Well, you didn't communicate what the actual problem was because you didn't want to upset them. So they're none the wiser. They could sense in your tone and in your voice that you're not really happy with them, but they don't really know why you're not happy. And so they can't really do anything about it. So you've all lost. How can we help you communicate effectively so that you get what you need from your employee who is under delivering? And so your employee understands what they need to do to enable you to be thrilled with their performance. And if you don't do that, and if you don't create that situation, then you're creating an inherent conflict later down the line because you as the manager have underperformed and you're not helping your employee stop underperforming either. And so then the accountability piece comes in to say, well, who's holding the manager accountable for not properly managing the employee? And that's the part that usually breaks down. And that's where you end up with the kind of embedding of the toxic cultures. So I'm all for, addressing some of those things holistically. And understanding that it's not just one part of the organization usually that's having a lot of problems. It's usually bottom up and top down. And okay, what does it look like to be really open about how we can all do better here? And framing that around the company's values usually is and their mission is usually a pretty good place to start.
Yeah, and that's
Or if they
some
don't
industries
know
you
what
get.
they are, right? Many boards of directors do not live out the values of the organization. It's a do what I say, not do what I do, and that's not helpful either.
Yeah, that's unfortunately comes from the culture that we both grew up in. And it just kinda it's something that's stuck. Hey, look, it worked for so long, and why change it? And sometimes things just need to change as you figure out that they actually don't, you know, um, so as you talk about it, where's like a success that you saw in like a cultural shift kind of taking place? Like,
I think people are really, 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 really resistant to change, and I massively underestimated how much time and energy and encouragement and hand holding it takes to get executives to move an inch. But once you get the ball rolling, it's kind of like one of those bowling balls where you manage to feed it down the middle of the lane, but it gets slower as it approaches the skittles. It's kind of that, you start off with a lot of inertia and then it's like, oh no, we're getting to that. It's really hard. It's really hard. Are we gonna? I'm like, look, guys, The goal is right there. Now is not the time to stop. Look how far you've come. And sometimes you have to take people up to the vista and say, okay, we're not at the summit, but like, look how far you've come. And let's just, check in. How are you feeling? How is this going for you? What have you learned about yourself? What have you learned about the people around you? Um, what's one thing that you wish that you'd done differently? What would you like to see in people around you if you had to go through this again? What surprised you? What are you proud of yourself for? Because I think if you can insert agency in each part of the process when it comes to change no longer becomes the thing that you fear, right? Because you're aided along that process and you are excited about getting through it, not for the sake of getting through it, because suddenly you're enjoying the journey. Heaven forbid the journey be the main event, not the outcome. And so far as possible, I had a mediation client I sat down with last week, and they had been very frustrated with me that this process is taking so long. And I said, well, hang on, don't think we really could have done this any faster. And to be fair, it has been months, but I said, look how far you've come. Look at all of the things that have changed that were not possible previously. We're not at the end. I agree with you. And it would be very nice if this was finished, but we're not there yet. But look where we are. Let's just take stock of where we are. And let's just celebrate how much it has taken of you to get here. And you're still intact. You are still okay. You are still able to advocate for yourself. And you still have a pretty clear picture of where you think you want to get to. So let's keep going. And sometimes it's that kind of gentleness, but also firmness of the we're not done, but I'm still here and I'm still with you and you're not alone in this. How can I encourage you to keep going? And sometimes that's, it's like the marathon runner who needs a boost at mile 20 because they just cannot go on. And that's why you don't see people supporting people at the marathons at the finish line. You see them dotted along the course because that's where they need that continual injection. And if you see change as like a marathon, not as a sprint, that's all we need. We need these milestones where you have these unexpected joys and bursts of progress so that people feel incentivized to keep going.
Yeah, because I mean, no matter whoever you are, kind of like a coalition.
Yeah, working on pioneering that with some senior leaders in the UK to bring about some of the legislative changes to embed these restorative approaches in institutional leaders in Britain.
How does that work? I mean, without divulging any secrets, stuff that you're not supposed to or whatever yet.
Oh
How does
no,
that look?
there's nothing secret about it. I think there's just quite a lot of operational stuff I need to do. So in the UK, for 34 years, the families of the Hillsborough football stadium disaster have been campaigning for a change to the law that would bring about a legal duty of candor for officials or institutional leaders so that they have a positive duty to tell the truth effectively rather than institutional cover-ups, of which the US is
Yeah,
intimately
we're great at that.
intimately
Our
aware of.
specialty.
And we think that's great. I'm a real fan of the proposed Hillsborough law, but I don't think it goes far enough because what is really needed for these institutions is an independent office for institutional accountability. And that independent office, independent being the key word, would have the power to oversee many of the cover-up amends, whether that's their financial payouts, whether that's redress of any kind, whether it's mediation schemes, whether it's restorative justice schemes, but most importantly, to impose a duty on prevention, not just reactivity. And so, in addition to that proposed change, as well as some further restorative approaches, so that kind of prevention rather than cure approach in that proposed legislation, that's the first thing that we want to see because Parliament, so Keir Starmer had committed that he would see this legislation through, and there have been some challenges in the last few months, and it's TBC. So we're going to basically be advocating that Labour politicians take these amendments seriously and it be something that unites the party, reminds the party what they stand for, who they're about, who they serve, and it could be a really exciting development. Or obviously it's politics, it could go nowhere. We will see. But the amendments have been drafted and there are people behind them, and if we can get a sufficient number of survivors to kind of write to their MPs and, propel this, well, I think it is a seismic change, and this is a huge undertaking. So I'm massively downplaying it, but I think it's achievable. And so systemic change is where there's a will, there's a way. And I am known for my tenacity. So I will be deploying all of that in the run up to Christmas for sure.
Yeah, I can only imagine that. I mean, that is institutional changes. It's not easy. I mean, the U.S. has been attempting to institute 10, 20 years, and really much has not been done about it. There's just so much stalemate. So the fact that you're even getting people to come to the table for that is kudos to you, because that is not easy to get people, especially leadership. They're comfortable. They came up in that kind of situation, that system, however you want to word it, and getting them open to changes. That's hard work. That's very, very hard work because you got to get them to see the light at the end of.
But Britain is broken. So people are willing to entertain, even if not support. And so there, uh, it feels like the time is ripe for some of these conversations, but it is definitely going to be a challenge. And it's one of those things you look back and you're like, if I'd known that this is what this was going to involve, I would not have embarked on this project. But it is such a privilege, and I've been off on holiday this week, so I haven't been thinking about it much, but I'll be excited to see if I can make some progress in coming weeks.
Yeah, no, I hope you can, because like the world just needs more people like that, because that's about the only way we're going to get away from this chaos and get back to some relatively normal. Go to the grocery store and people feel like comfortable doing it again. You don't feel so anxious when you walk in the door. Those type of things, right? Like, and I don't think a lot of people see how something like what you're doing can impact their ability to do that and kind of get back to the nostalgia of what they had 20 years ago, where they felt comfortable doing that. Like that nostalgia has just been shattered. I mean, it's gone. And like I had said, COVID really shattered that nostalgia back. It was kind of, everybody knew that stuff was kind of irrelevant. You had nothing to do but look at it. You had nothing to
Right.
do but acknowledge what was going on around you, because I mean, you had nowhere to go. Everything was shut down. I mean, there was no distractions. I tell my son, I said, to me, part of the problem is, like you were saying earlier, we don't. It's devices are kind of. I want to say that they're the cause of it, right? But it's our lack as a society, because devices have always been there, just maybe not as sophisticated, but they've always been there. It's just different things for different eras. But like we kind of grew up in starting in an analog world, and then we transition, right? So it's a little bit different for us, where the youngsters, they're only going into a digital world that is becoming more complex, and that's
Right.
not easy. And what you're doing is, it's going to help. It's going to make a big difference. Hopefully it can make some difference over here across this pond, because and I just the unfortunate part about the United States is when Parliament, I believe, does something there. It's see here. I mean, like here you got the federal
Each
government can
individual
do it.
state. Yeah.
Yeah, the federal government does it. Then you got to try to convince each state to kind of join in, and that's why it strong arm states into going the direction they want them to go in. And it's difficult. Here I think if if the government had to actually debate on how to pay an electric bill, I think that their lights would go out before they actually figured out how to do it, just because of that partisan, that no legitimate reason.
Yeah.
Because they all got skeletons in their closet. They all just close the door when they want to look in.
It's easier though.
Oh yeah, I mean, I've seen some clips of how the Parliament there. I think it's the
House of Commons and House of
House,
Lords.
yes, House of Lords. And I've just seen, woof, man, they get animated compared to American politicians.
Yeah, but that's the role of high quality debate. Although I'm not sure that the House of Commons has demonstrated high quality debate in quite some time, but that's just a personal opinion.
Yeah, the United States has gone away from debate. They try to get away from it. It's in the United States now, the Speaker of the House pretty much. Whereas when our time was coming up, they had there's still the committees are there, but if a committee had enough support, no matter what the House Speaker thought, it would get voted on. Whereas to now is the House Speaker pretty much.
About power. It's about power.
Yes.
Ruling with an iron fist. He's doing a great
Yeah.
job of it. But
Yeah.
at what cost?
I mean, yeah. I mean, it's just it's hard. I mean, it's kind of like you're talking, people feel broken. I mean, a lot of people feel America is broken. They feel like, hey, man, I went to college for 6 years and spent $70,000. The job that companies are offering me is $40,000. How am I supposed to buy a house when a house is 400,000? And that's just it creates the situation which you got, And I tell people, political leaders here only have themselves to point at because they help create the situation. They created it, because all they did was tell. They never really speak about how much good is actually. So that's all people see. They don't talk about, hey, moms are having a good time with this. It's just the positive is just completely. It's just pure negative. So it's very just weird. When I was growing up, the news always did talk about the bad things, but they always seem to have segments on good things too, right? Just hey, here's this fluffy part of the news, and I felt like that just changed the pace.
Well, now it's just about eyeballs, and the most shocking news gets eyeballs. And also, I think a lot of news media outlets have shifted to ensure that they're covering what's being released on social media first. News outlets used to be the first to break a lot of news, and now that's not how creators or celebrities or businesses are breaking news anymore. So often I feel like I'm watching TikTok when I'm just trying to read the news.
Yes. Something that as we wrap up, something that I learned I don't know about how it works there, but here, news organizations, a lot of them like CNN, things of that nature, they changed how they're defined. So they're no longer defined as news organizations, they're defined as entertainment companies.
Right.
So now when they kind of twist the truth a little bit or kind of just make it look, there's no penalty. Whereas if you're a
Correct.
dedicated, established news company, if you did that, you would have to like issue huge.
That's yeah. That's been the huge controversy with GB News in the UK because of breaching Ofcom regulations, and they're like, well, we're not a traditional news media company, so you can't hold us to the same standard as the BBC. It's really
Yeah,
interesting.
and I feel that they definitely need it. I mean, without killing freedom of speech, because that's big here. Once you start telling people they can't say something that will set this whole country off the edge of a cliff. If you start censoring people here, I mean, it's wild. Like Americans are so divided, but when you kind of start going down that rabbit hole, all of a sudden the unity just starts. A lot of people hate each other, but it's like,
Yeah,
hey man, but
yeah.
that guy's still got to be allowed to say it. I just got to be allowed to yell back at him, and that's kind of it's a double edged sword. And I know freedom of speech is a little bit different in Europe than it is here. It's not as open as what Americans would call freedom of speech, but I mean, I would assume it's still pretty open, considering know that there's a lot more here.
Yeah, but I think everything has been weaponized, and that's where the problem is. And then what's the line between freedom of speech and hate speech and misogyny? And I don't know. It's a very interesting time we live in.
Yeah, no, and like I said, the things you're doing are definitely going to help push things in the right direction because there's just got to be something. There just has to happen because everything's at a stalemate. Western culture just in general is at a stalemate. It's either got to adapt or Western culture has to adapt to its own people. Whereas Western culture is still kind of like a blend of modern and Victorian values, right? And now the Victorian values are kind of being completely phased out. And that is just, that's not something a lot of people see. Those Victorian values
Yeah,
are kind of, I mean, even though it's an English thing, it's kind of what really America was built on
yeah.
was those Victorian values, and that's just, is different. It's very, very different, you know, but, I appreciate your time today.
It's been a great conversation. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, no, it's always, different perspectives is what it's always about. What folks like you are doing to kind of find where that, to me, middle spot is, right? Like, how do we get people to come to the table? How do we get them to solve the problem? Those conversations are, I personally think, are what a lot more people want than the news in anything is really willing to tell us. Yeah, because here in the States, I mean, obviously neighbors are a little bit different, but where they're going out the house and hey neighbor, how are you doing today? And it's a lot more awkward now than when I was growing up. When I was growing up, then the neighbor would be like, hey, did you know this sign's just random stuff? And I've kind of tried to make an effort recently to it's different, and it's my son kind of looks at me like I'm crazy until 10, 15 years ago. So, but I appreciate your time, Leah. Keep doing what you're doing. Passionate about, and I've got friends across the ponds. You know, it's just it's stuff that matters, and as separate as the as America and Europe are, they still have so much more. And if push came to shove, if the world kind of went super chaotic again, both linking up. Because when push comes to shove, we have a whole lot more in common as cultures, and I think that is a very understated situation. America is essentially Europe 2.0. I say in a lot of ways. Its governing style is, the French. America's laws are based off of English common law. It's essentially Britain that doesn't have a king. I joke around that sometimes here, America is switching to a system of an elected, and an elected representative. You'll elect
I
you to
mean,
die.
it feels a lot like that at the moment.
Yeah, I mean it's less probably 4 presidents. It's been which one can write the more orders. They always want to overdo the previous one, and it's like I've always just one up another legislative branch and just kind of go back to the way it was 40 years ago. But times change. People got to change with them. So, but thank you so much again for coming on. I appreciate it. And I hope you have a good one.
Thank you so much. You too. Get
Thank
in
you.
touch if you're ever over in England.
For sure. For sure.